Good evening, and welcome to this week's Shiur, which is yesterday was, of course, the 24th day of the Omer. For those of you who didn't count, I think it's a good idea to start a Shiur with at least that cognizance and to try to remember. I've not yet been able to make the bracha. This week's Parsha or Parshiot are Achrei and Kedoshim, and one could give an entire year's worth of shiurim on the topics that are mentioned here, the mitzvot that we have. Rashi tells us that these are gufei haTorah. These are the essential elements of the Torah. Rabbi Akiva says, for example, on the mitzvah of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, ze klal gadol b'Torah, that is the chief operating principle of the Torah. That if one wants to know what the essential element of the Torah is that actually ignites and guides and inspires all of the mitzvot, it would be the concept of v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Now, it is interesting that I'd like to begin by just a little statement about something that Rav Hirsch mentions, not on this parsha, but he mentions it regarding the word reacha. You know, when it comes to the Sheva brachas, the chassan and the kala are called reim ahuvim. Reim ahuvim, reish ayin, yud mem, reim ahuvim. So the question is, what are reim? We say that they're beloved friends, and that's true. But Rav Hirsch, as he spent a good part of his life in research of etymology, came to the following conclusion. The word re'im is actually related to the word ro'eh with an ayin. Ro'eh is to graze. When sheep are in a field, we say that the person who watches them is called a ro'eh. And we actually say that the act of getting nourishment that the sheep get from the vegetation that they eat, that's called hem ro'im. They are ingesting the nutrition and the nutrients which are found in the vegetation that they eat. What does that have to do with human beings who are beloved, husband and a wife, chatan v'kala? What does that have to do with it? So Rav Hirsch says that what happens to a sheep when it ingests the food or the grass that is there, what happens is that he ingests it, swallows it. It then at some point it becomes a part of the sheep. Just as when we eat food, we eat it. A part of it becomes a part of us. Some of it, of course, is dispelled, but that nutrition is what keeps us alive, which invigorates us. So Rav Hirsch says the term re'im, when two people truly love each other, and it doesn't matter whether they are husband and wife, parent and child, but primarily peers, all right, or just friends who have a deep and abiding affection for each other. What takes place? Let's say I have a dear friend, and that friend and I engage in a spiritual growth. So a part of him is imbibed within me. Part of me is now a part of him. So that's what makes us re'im ahuvim, souls that become united. Now, I must tell you that I had a very, very good friend. And once when I was in Eretz Israel, I was at some sort of social event, and I looked in the mirror, and I saw the person whom I thought was my friend. And I hadn't seen my friend in more than a year, and I was looking forward to seeing him anyway. So I immediately used the mirror to help me determine exactly where he was standing. And I went there, and I was ready to embrace him with the feelings of love that I have. and it wasn't my friend. It happened to be somebody who looked a bit like my friend. All the feelings of love, all the feelings of warmth and devotion immediately disappeared. Not hatred, mind you, just they disappeared. So what made us re'im? What made us people who are beloved friends? What happens is our souls were united. When two people truly are beloved friends, then that which makes them noble is shared. Each partakes of what the other has to offer. And that's re'im ahuvim. And the Torah tells us, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, that you and I, each of us, have the mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael. That's the mitzvah of Ahavat Yisrael. So I want to first begin, actually I've begun, haven't I? But I want to first begin our exploration of the Meforshim in the text by looking at the Sefer HaChinuch. Now, the Sefer HaChinuch talks to us about the mitzvot that we have throughout the Torah. The mitzvah, and he lists them in the order of appearance in the Torah. He generally follows the Rambam in his definition of the mitzvot themselves. And even where there is a slight, at one point or another, the Rambam, the Ramban, other Rishonim may disagree on whether certain mitzvot are actually independent mitzvot or whether they're part of other mitzvot. But he generally, the Sefer Chinuch generally follows the rule of the Rambam. And if first it pays for us to read the psukim related here, and then I'll read the Sefer Chinuch. In Perek, in Kedoshim, Perek Yud Tet, Pasuk Yud Zayin. The Torah tells us about the key as to how we are to look at the world, how we are to look at other human beings. Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. The Torah in the Vayikra, Perek Yud Tet, Pasuk Yud Zayin says, you may not detest your brother, because the Torah wants to stress, that's your brother. You may like him, you may not like him, that's your brother. Et achicha bilvavecha, in your heart. Which means to say that oftentimes we as human beings find ourselves caught up in petty disputes. Oftentimes it's petty disputes, misunderstandings, hurt feelings. That can happen in any relationship, no matter what the relationship is, whether it is best friends, whether it's husband, wife, whether it's business partners, it can happen. So the Torah tells us, Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. Do not detest your brother in your heart. But rather, the Torah says, get it out. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. You should, now the term used here is rebuke. I'm going to explain why I don't particularly like it, but we'll talk about it in a second. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. Rather, you should lovingly criticize your brother, or your the person who is your neighbor. Velo tisa alav chet. Now, this phrase, velo tisa alav chet, can be interpreted in at least two ways. The first way to interpret it is you may not bear a sin because of him. So the pasuk says it can actually divide it into three parts. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Rather, tell him what has hurt you, annoyed you, troubled you, and velo tisa alav chet, because if you just hate him in your heart and you're always angry at him, so that in itself is a chet. That in itself is something wrong. Another way to interpret that third clause is you may not detest your brother in your heart. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. You must tell him what he's done wrong. It could be to you, and halacha talks about the fact that he has been doing either mitzvot wrong or conducting himself wrong, any number of ways that he's done wrong. But then the last phrase says, "Velo tisa alav chet." Be careful how you do it. Don't make matters worse. Don't embarrass him. From here, Chazal talked to us about the terrible issur of Amal bin Panei Chavero, that a person is not allowed to cause another person, deliberately cause them to blush, to embarrass them to such a degree that they first get blushed. That's bad enough, and then of course they can become pale, and that's called Hamal bin Panei Chavero. Ein lo chelek l'olam haba. Now, whether Chazal means us to take that literally, or it means us to say that you've hurt your eternity when you do that, to cause another human being, another Jew, particularly, to be embarrassed. So this pasuk is the beginning of a series of psukim, or a series of halachot that have to do with interpersonal relations. So that's the first thing. Mitzvah number one is don't detest someone in your heart. Don't just walk around angry. You should tell him what he's done wrong, either to you or what he's doing wrong to Hashem. But remember, when you tell him, be careful. Do it properly. Don't embarrass him. That's pasuk Yud Zayin. Then pasuk Yud Chet tells us, Lo tikom v'lo titor. Now you know that every root in Hebrew, virtually every root in Hebrew, has three letters to it. Notice tikom here does not have three letters. It means it has three letters, but the three letters of the shorish are not all there. The nun very often drops. Really, the shorish of the word is nakom, nakama, to take nakama. And what is nakama? Nakama is when I do an action. First and foremost, nakama involves an action. You did something to me, now I will respond in kind. And the intention is not to rectify the situation, but rather to get even. And that, the Torah tells us, you're over an avera. If you say lo tikom v'lo titor, if you do nakama, you're involved in some form of vengeful act, so then you've committed an avera, like people eat treif, like people do all kinds of averas. And v'lo titor, the Torah goes a step further. The word titor, once again, you can see there's only two letters of the shorish. The shorish is nator, nun tet resh. Nator, both in Aramaic and in Hebrew, means to bear a grudge, to keep it inside. You may not do that. You have to put things aside. When we do, when things get done, we can't keep continuing, even if we don't do an act. Even if we don't do the act, if we are forever angry at that person inside, it's an avera. Not only that, by the way, it's not healthy. That's probably as important as not bearing a grudge against the person, is the idea that within you, you're koching, things build up within you, and you yourself turn into the very person that you don't like. And so therefore the Torah tells us, lo tikom v'lo titor et b'nei amecha, any part of the Jewish people. And then the Torah concludes this segment by simply saying, ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, ani Hashem. You must love your neighbor as yourself, whatever that means, as yourself, ani Hashem. Meaning to say, don't forget, we've talked about two elements of interpersonal relations that nobody else will know but you. The first one is despising a person. The second one is maintaining an anger within you. Now, only Hashem and you know that there's the anger. Once you act on it, then everybody knows. Then that's nakama. That you're not supposed to do too. That does not mean in any way, shape, or form that you can't take action to correct the problem. If somebody has money that is really yours, so you have recourse. You can take a person to Beis Din. You can talk with them. Others can, you can work that out. But the idea is to say, well, he keyed my car. I think I'll key his car. That's nakama. That you can't do because you're no better off. It feels good for a moment or two, but it isn't good. That's nakama. Okay. So, and this is what Rabbi Akiva said is klal gadol b'Torah, And the word l'reacha, as I mentioned earlier, is Rav Hirsch's view that you should look at each person as someone who has good qualities that you need to adopt for yourself. And if every Jew does that, so then it's our lives are enriched by that. Now, let's take a look and go back now to the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch tells us, first of all, you're not supposed to despise your friend. All these mitzvot are listed as parts of the 613 mitzvot that we have. All right. Mitzvah number 239 is not to, mitzvah number 238 is not to hate someone in your heart. Mitzvah 239 is the mitzvah of lovingly criticizing someone. Now, I'd like to point something out, and that is that all of Jewish education is the mitzvah of hocheach tochiach tamitecha. Little children, and even when they're bigger children, need loving criticism. And Chazal tell us, im ein ahava ein tochacha. If there is not love, if you really love someone, then you'll be willing to help him or her to live up to his or her fullest potential. If you love them, you don't just allow them to do things that are wrong, not in their ultimate best interest. But Chazal also say, im ein ahava ein tochacha. If you don't love the person, then you may not engage in this form of loving criticism because you don't love him. And if that's the case, all you're doing is picking on him. And oftentimes I feel as a teacher, it's very important that when you walk into a classroom, you can say it to yourself or say it out loud, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. I have to realize that I can be mekayim the mitzvah of loving my fellow Jew as I would want to be loved myself. And if I can't feel that way, if I don't feel that way about a child, again, you can't love somebody else like you love yourself exactly. Rav Hirsch talks about that. And you can't love and you can't love someone exactly as you love your own children. But to want them to be able to live to their potential and to rejoice when they do well, and to genuinely feel bad when they don't do well, that's a form of ahava itself. And on that, the mitzvah of chinuch is tochacha. Tochacha is to get people to be able to live to their full potential. And when you do that, then you're kind of the mitzvah of ahava. Now let's take a look and see what the Sefer HaChinuch says about the mitzvah of ahavat Yisrael, the love of every Jew. Le'ahov kol echad miYisrael ahavat nefesh. To love every Jew with an ahavat nefesh, a soulful love, ahavat nefesh. A very, very interesting phrase, because I believe all ahava is really nefesh. Again, if I don't love the person because of how he looks or how she looks, if I really want to love the person, then I love their neshama, and I want them to be the best person that they possibly can. That's what parenting does. That's what chinuch does. And when we fall in love with the exterior looks of a person, one way or the other, that's not love. That's infatuation. It's not love. And that's why the chinuch says ahavat nefesh, the love of the soul. Klomar, he says that we should have compassion on every Jew and on the property, and that we have to feel for that person when they suffer loss, to rejoice with that person when they do well. And Rav Hirsch puts it very well. He says it doesn't say, when it says v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, you should love your fellow Jew as you. By the way, that does not have to exclude a non-Jew by any means, but there's a special mitzvah of ahavat Yisrael, which we have. So the idea of loving them is that they should fulfill their potential. And Rav Hirsch says, "V'ahavta l'reacha." It doesn't say you should love your fellow man or fellow human being. It says you should love l'reacha. You want for your fellow human being that which you would want for yourself. Everybody needs food. Everybody needs shelter. Everybody needs to feel love. So that's when you're Mekayim the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, when you want for your fellow Jew what you yourself want for you. Doesn't mean that I love them like I love myself. It doesn't even mean I love them like I love my own children or my wife. It means I want for them to be able to fulfill their full positive potential. That is love. As a matter of fact, the Navi says about David, when he raised his children, he loved his children. He did love his children, but he never disciplined them. That's what the Navi says. Lo atzavo me'olam. David never disciplined. When that happens, so a child does not live to his full potential because he doesn't know, he has no sense of direction. So I remember when I was growing up, and many of my friends who were growing up, it was, they'd call their parents by their first name, and they were friends, and that doesn't help. What helps is to lovingly guide the people that we love in the area that we are fit to guide them. That's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik calls it social responsiveness. Social responsiveness. And it seems to me in the age in which we're living, the concept of being socially responsible is so important. Yes, we have to care about suffering. We have to care if there are people who are living below the poverty level, whether I know them, I don't know them. If they're suffering, I have to feel it. And one of the things that's important, I believe, is that, we wake up in the morning, we know that there is suffering and sadness in the world, poverty, pain. Now, I can't walk around sad all day. Very few people have the capacity to do that. I guess there are people, but most of us don't have that capacity. But to walk around never giving them a thought, and I'm talking about Jews and non-Jews. For example, the Rambam tells us, and the Gemara tells us, that we have a mitzvah of nichum avelim for non-Jews as well, a mitzvah when people who are either sick or they are mourners. We have an obligation, whether it's to Jews or to non-Jews, we have an obligation to participate in their joyful occasions, where it's appropriate, and in their pain. That's empathy. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is a form of empathy that we have to have when other people are sad, and of course to be able to truly be happy with them when they're happy. Now, I want to share something with you. We should be able to get it in. One of the great philosophers, actually, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T. Kant was to philosophy in the 18th century what Einstein was to physics in the early 20th century and throughout the 20th century, and maybe even now, which means to say people in that field, whether it's in philosophy or in the case of Einstein, physics, if you really want to make a name for yourself, you will study Einstein or you'll study Kant. If you find that Einstein, his theory, in some way, shape, or form has a flaw in it, and you find it, your life is now complete, right? And the same thing is in regard to Kant. The reason is Immanuel Kant tried to construct a lifestyle, a morality based solely upon autonomous thinking, rational thinking. And why? Because in the age in which he lived, people they didn't believe in revelation, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to us a Torah and mitzvot and a moral code. All of Europe was beginning to depart from that idea. And so he said, if that's the case, how do I know whether something is moral? How do I know whether something is moral? So he writes the following, Kant. He says, this is called the categorical imperative. Categorical means universal, imperative law. The universal law of ethics, he said, is if you want to know whether you're acting ethically, he said, that you shall desire that whatever you do, before you do it, should it be a universal law or not? In other words, let's go to keying a car, okay? Somebody keyed my car, or they owe me $100, let's say. And the Torah tells us, lo tikom v'lo titor. You're not allowed to take action of vengeance, and you're not even allowed to just let it boil. And if you have legal recourse, absolutely. But to say, okay, now I know I'm going to get even. He keyed my car, or he owes me $100 or $500. I'm going to key his car. So Kant said you have to ask yourself. You have to ask yourself, if you want to know whether that would be moral to key the guy's car, if everybody did that, what would the world be like? Should that be a universal law that it is acceptable to cause property damage to another person who owes you money and hasn't paid you? And so Kant said, if you can say that you want that it should be universal law, then maybe that's an ethical act. So the Malbim, who lived actually a little bit after Kant, he lived in Eastern Europe, and the Malbim is one of the great modern commentaries on the Torah. He must have read Kant, because he quotes Kant verbatim, literally verbatim. So he says that if one wants, this is what he doesn't say who, he wouldn't quote him as Kant. He would just simply say, the philosophers say. He said that if one wants to cause some sort of harm to his friend, instead of hoping that through that he will get some sort of reward, he'll get some sort of a benefit. So then he has to ask, well, if everybody did it, how would that be? And the Malbim says, that's not morality. That's self-interest. That's not morality. Morality is, well, let's talk about what self-interest is. Self-interest is, I don't want to do it. I don't want somebody to do it to me, so I won't do it to him. So therefore, Kant said, well, if, you have to ask yourself, can I key or do damage to this other person's car? So Kant said, well, before you do it, think this through. If it should be a universal law that everybody who's unhappy can damage other people's property, then it's probably a moral act. So the Malbim said, no. It might be a good, little bit of a deterrent for doing wrong. That's not a moral act. Moral act is an act that is done not from self-interest. It's an act which is done for the benefit of another human being, altruism. We call it in English, we call it an altruistic act. There are very few of them, very few people who are completely altruistic, very few. So he says what Kant's theory boils down to is self-interest. And he calls it a Gan Eden of self-interest, meaning to say, you think it's a Garden of Eden, people will act that way. He said, not true, right? It really boils down to self-interest. So the Malbim says, here's what V'ahavta recha kamocha means. It means everyone needs to see all humanity, and he says all humanity, not just Jews, all humanity, keguf echad, as one body. When I look at humanity, I need to see me in relationship to my neighbor, that I am part of the same body. And he says, kolel gam nochrim. That would include even people who are non-Jews. We have to see ourselves all as creations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we are all one body. And he says, what does that mean that we say one is one body? It means that if my left hand is causing me pain, my right hand can't say, yeah, but I'm okay, right? It means that I don't say only my left hand hurts. I say I hurt. My body hurts. And that, says the Malbim, that's V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. If there's suffering around us, if there are people who are indigent and poor, people who aren't clothed, people who are lonely, people who are outcasts on the fringe of society. I may not be able to help all of them all the time, but I need to feel it. I need to empathize with people. Empathy itself is a form of love. And so we've explored V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, and of course we could actually explore V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha 2 or 3 more shiurim, according to what Chazal tell us, etc. But what have we learned? We've learned, first of all, that the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha actually is the last in a chain of interpersonal relationships that is actually 2 psukim long. You can even go back further. The Torah begins, don't hate. Hatred is a counterproductive act, and it usually leads nowhere. And remember, says the Torah, Lo sisna et achicha. Even when you're upset, that is your brother. And hatred, wishing ill for him, is not the way a Jew should conduct himself, but rather hocheach tochiach et amitecha. Tell the person if they've harmed you or done wrong. Sometimes it's a hard thing to do face to face, but not sometimes, it's often, almost always hard to do. But it beats harboring inside the hatred that every time you think about him, every time you see him, you become even more incensed. And if the person is doing something wrong, maybe they're doing a mitzvah wrong, or they may be doing something which is an avera. So if they'll listen to you, Chazal tell us, if they listen to you, you can be Mekayim the mitzvah, and you should be Mekayim the mitzvah, ocheach tochiach, lovingly criticizing your friend, not rebuke. Rebuke is a very tough word, but loving criticism. Last, we must remember that ein tochacha b'li ahava. There can be no true mitzvah of tochacha, of lovingly criticizing a person, unless you love that person at some level. The ein ahava b'li tochacha. But remember, people can say that they love someone, but if they allow them, shall we say, to just wander, if they allow them just to tread water and they don't do anything to help them get better, then they've missed out on a golden opportunity. Finally, v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. A person that you love should take in what other people whom you love have to offer you. Avat nefesh, a soulful love is what is expected of us, and that we should be able to say that we truly want what is best for our friend and best for each person. And for example, the mitzvah of wearing a mask, some Gedolim say, I don't know, now it's beginning to pass. It's not all gone. But there was one posek, I believe he was in New York, who said every time he put on a mask, he would say, because my mask protects you, your mask protects me. And that is an open way for us to show our love. That's maybe a commercial a bit, but still I think it's something which we should bear in mind. Okay, everyone, I want to wish everybody a very good week and a happy day after the 24th of the Omer. And Emir Hashem will see you next week, which will be Parshat Emor. Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.